One courthouse morning turned into a spectacle no one will ever forget when Officer Derek McAllister slapped a woman he thought was powerless, only to discover she was Judge Lorraine Parker, the presiding authority of that very courtroom. What happened next exposed 15 years of buried corruption and shook an entire police department. Stay curious, subscribe now, hit like, and share this story so millions more can see justice hit back. The morning sun had barely climbed above the skyline when the first ripples of tension began forming at the steps of the county courthouse. The stone columns rose like guardians of justice, but what unfolded beneath them was nothing short of a betrayal of everything those walls were meant to stand for. Officer Derek McAllister had been stationed there since 7 o'clock, pacing the granite landing with the restless energy of a man who carried more anger than discipline. Colleagues whispered about his short fuse, his habit of escalating the smallest encounters into shows of dominance. 15 years on the force, dozens of complaints, and not one reprimand that stuck. To him, the courthouse wasn't a temple of law. It was his personal stage, and today he was about to give his most vicious performance yet. At precisely 8:47 in the morning, a woman turned the corner onto Main Street and began climbing the courthouse steps. She was dressed in civilian clothes, a dark blazer slacks, pressed sharp, modest shoes that tapped steadily against the stone. In her left hand, she carried a leather briefcase so worn it seemed molded to her grip, filled with files, neatly arranged for the cases she was scheduled to oversee that day. Her pace was calm, deliberate, the pace of someone who belonged here. But in McAllister's eyes, she was already guilty of existing in a space he thought should be reserved for people who looked like him. "Hey!" His voice cut across the plaza, sharp and contemptuous. "Where do you think you're going?" The woman paused, surprised but composed. "I'm headed inside," she answered evenly, her voice calm, carrying none of the submission McAllister expected. That alone set his jaw tightening. To him, every syllable sounded like defiance. He stepped into her path, the polished toe of his boot striking the top step with deliberate force. The air seemed to still around them as he squared his shoulders, looming taller than his actual height. "You people don't belong walking in like this," he sneered, his words laced with disdain. "You think this place is for you?" His eyes narrowed, roaming over her blazer and slacks with open contempt. "Looks like stolen property to me. Looks like you're trying to play dress-up." Before she could reply, his hand lashed out faster than most witnesses could register. The crack of palm against cheek rang out, echoing between the courthouse columns like a gunshot. Her head snapped to the side from the forced strands of hair flying loose. The briefcase slipped from her fingers and hit the steps with a heavy thud. Its contents burst forth stacks of legal briefs, court memoranda, official documents marked with seals and stamps, all scattering in the breeze like confetti at a grotesque parade. Papers fluttered down the stairs, tumbling into the street below, where passing pedestrians slowed, uncertain, watching the scene unfold. McAllister's lips curled into a sneer. "Thought you could just stroll in here. Not today." He shoved her backward until her shoulder blades slammed against the cold granite wall of the courthouse itself. The impact reverberated through her spine, but still she refused to cry out. She locked her eyes, not on the officer's snarling face, but above his head, toward the gleaming bronze nameplate fixed over the massive wooden doors. It read, "United States District Court, Presiding Judge L. Parker." She didn't need to speak. The truth of who she was already stared down at them both. But McAllister didn't look. He didn't care. His grip found her wrist, twisting it behind her back, metal cuffs biting into skin with mechanical finality. Criminal in disguise, he spat, tightening the second cuff, until the ratchet clicked painfully. Trespassing on forbidden ground. Filthy animals like you don't walk these steps. By now, 2 other officers stationed nearby had wandered closer, drawn by the commotion. One of them raised a phone recording the spectacle with a smirk. A third leaned against the railing, chuckling as though this were nothing more than morning entertainment. None moved to stop it. None asked a single question. Their laughter filled the air, casual and cruel, the kind of laughter that comes when prejudice feels safe, when silence is guaranteed. The woman, Judge Lorraine Parker, though they did not yet know her name, remained upright. Her chin held steady even as the bruise on her cheekbone began to darken. She did not struggle, did not beg, did not grant McAllister the satisfaction of fear. Her silence was not weakness. It was calculation, every second a measured step in a larger march toward justice that he couldn't fathom. McAllister yanked her forward, parading her up the final steps as if she were some trophy of conquest. Each file page still tumbling across the pavement seemed to whisper the truth he refused to see. This wasn't a trespasser. This wasn't a fraud. This was the very authority he claimed to defend. But in his arrogance, blinded by 15 years of unchallenged abuse, he never even glanced down. "Look here, boys," McAllister barked over his shoulder. "Another one trying to sneak in like she owns the place." He shoved her again for emphasis, his voice echoing across the entrance. The gathered officers laughed louder their chorus, sealing the cruelty of the moment. For the pedestrians across the street, it was a scene both familiar and chilling, a black woman manhandled by a white officer. Papers scattering like the debris of dignity. Some froze in place, others hurried away, unwilling to be caught up in trouble. They feared might follow them. No one yet realized the magnitude of what they were seeing. No one could guess that the woman walking silently in chains was not just another defendant, but the presiding judge of that very courthouse. The irony was suffocating. On the very steps meant to symbolize equality under law, prejudice was parading itself in plain view. Justice had been assaulted before it even entered the building. Lorraine Parker, though, carried herself with unflinching poise. Every insult he hurled, every shove against her back, every snicker from his colleagues became fuel for the fire she kept, banked deep within. She knew the truth would come. She knew evidence had a way of outliving lies. And most of all, she knew that men like Derek McAllister always wrote their own downfall in the arrogance of believing they could never be challenged. By 8:55, less than 10 minutes after that first slap, Judge Lorraine Parker had been dragged inside the courthouse in chains. To the onlookers, it seemed like just another morning in a system that always believed an officer's story over a black woman's voice. To McAllister, it was a routine display of power, the kind he had staged countless times before. But to history, to the legacy that would grow from this moment, it was the first strike of a gavel that had not yet fallen. Because what Officer Derek McAllister didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the woman he had just called an animal, the woman whose face now bore the mark of his contempt, was the Honorable Judge Lorraine Parker. And in trying to strip her of dignity on the courthouse steps he had handed her, the very evidence she needed to strip him of everything, his badge, his freedom, his future. The collision at the courthouse gate wasn't just a confrontation. It was the spark that would ignite a reckoning 15 years overdue, a reckoning that would ripple from those scattered papers on the ground to the highest levels of federal oversight. By the time the sun set that evening, justice would no longer be a silent ideal carved into marble. It would be a living force carried in the voice of a woman who refused to break, and in the downfall of a man who thought he could never fall. The steel cuffs bit deeper into her wrists as Officer Derek McAllister yanked her forward, dragging her across the final steps like a prize he had claimed. The courthouse doors, two massive slabs of oak polished by decades of use, swung wide under his shove, and the woman he believed to be a powerless intruder stumbled into the marble atrium. The sound of her heels echoed sharp against the floor, each strike a reminder of her dignity, though he tried to grind it out of her with every tug of his hand. Around them, officers who had drifted toward the commotion formed a loose circle, their faces alive with smirks and whispers, phones angled discreetly to capture the moment. The glow of screens reflected in their eyes, as though this were nothing more than a show staged for their entertainment. McAllister thrived on the attention. His chest swelled beneath the uniform, every motion exaggerated for the benefit of his audience. "See this?" he barked, tightening his grip on her arm, as though to remind everyone that he was in charge. Caught her sneaking in with stolen files. Thought she was clever. Thought she could fool us. He shook her roughly for emphasis, and laughter rolled through the gallery of uniforms like applause. No one corrected him. No one asked questions. In their silence lived complicity, the silent contract that had protected him for 15 years. The woman, Judge Lorraine Parker, kept her chin lifted, her spine rigid, her eyes forward. The sting of his slap still throbbed across her cheek, already darkening into a bruise, but she refused to let her gaze drop. Instead, she fixed it on the towering plaque mounted above the central security gate, the Honorable Lorraine Parker, presiding judge. The letters gleamed under the atrium lights, carved deep into bronze, as permanent as the stone that held the courthouse upright. To the officers jeering around her, it was just another ornament. To her, it was a silent reminder of the truth. This was her domain, her bench, her house of law. And though she now entered it in chains, she would leave it commanding authority. McAllister, blind to everything but his own theater, shoved her through the metal detector without bothering to silence its shrill alarm. The high-pitched wail pierced the atrium as she passed through, but instead of investigating, the guards at the station laughed harder, one of them mock-saluting her as though she were a clown in costume. Careful, another joked, might be carrying explosives in that briefcase she dropped. More laughter. More cameras. Not one hand moved to pick up the legal papers still strewn on the courthouse steps outside. Justice itself lay scattered in the wind, and no one bent to catch it. The humiliation deepened as McAllister paraded her through the main corridor. Lawyers in suits, clerks with stacks of files, and citizens waiting for hearings all stopped to watch. To them, it looked like another arrest, another criminal dragged in before the court. Whispers passed quickly from mouth to mouth, some curious, others judgmental. A mother tugged her child out of the way, muttering about people causing trouble. A man in a business suit shook his head, as though confirming some private prejudice. Each stranger's glance became another weight pressing against Lorraine, but still she refused to bow. Her chin stayed high, her pace steady, even as McAllister jerked her forward with needless force. Eyes front, he barked, though she had never once looked away. He wanted her small. He wanted her cowed. Instead, her silence filled the corridor louder than any protest could. It unnerved him, though he masked it with arrogance. To his audience, he played the hero, the guardian of justice, saving the courthouse from an imposter. Inside, however, a sliver of unease scratched at his confidence. Why hadn't she begged? Why hadn't she shouted the usual refrains? "I didn't do anything, I'm innocent. Call my lawyer." Her composure was unnatural, unsettling, as though she were the one waiting for him to reveal his hand. But McAllister doubled down too deep in the performance to retreat. He shoved her into the main courtroom antechamber, past the portraits of judges who had served before her. Their painted eyes seemed to follow him, though he never looked up. He was too busy announcing his triumph to anyone within earshot. "Caught this one trying to sneak past security with stolen documents," he declared. His words bounced off the high ceilings, echoing like proclamations of truth. A few clerks looked up from their desks, frowning faintly, but said nothing. The badge on his chest shielded him from challenge as it always had. Through it all, Lorraine Parker's focus never wavered. She knew every hallway, every portrait, every brass plaque mounted on the walls. She had walked these paths for 23 years, first as prosecutor, then as judge. Each step in chains now carved itself into her memory like fire. She was not simply enduring the humiliation she was recording, it cataloging every smirk, every cruel laugh, every moment of silence from those who looked away. It would all become evidence. Evidence not only against McAllister, but against the system that had enabled him to drag a federal judge through her own courthouse like a thief. By 9 o'clock, less than 15 minutes after the first slap outside, Lorraine was shoved into the defendant's chair of courtroom 2, her wrists still cuffed, her face marked by bruises. The irony was suffocating. She had presided over thousands of defendants in that very seat, but never imagined she would occupy it herself. McAllister straightened his uniform, cleared his throat, and prepared to spin his story. His colleagues lined the back wall phones, still recording, waiting for their friend to perform the same tired script that had worked so many times before. The humiliation was real, sharp, and public. But Lorraine Parker's eyes remained fixed on a higher truth: the bronze plaque at the courthouse entrance, the judicial seal above the bench, the oath she had sworn to uphold. She was the law here, not Derek McAllister. And though she sat in handcuffs now, she knew the moment was coming when the roles would reverse, when the gavel would fall, and when every laugh echoing through those marble halls would be replaced by silence. For McAllister, this was another victory, another chance to strut in front of his peers. For the courthouse staff and the citizens in the gallery, it was a fleeting curiosity. But for history, for the legacy that would spread from this room, it was the turning point. Because Judge Lorraine Parker's humiliation was not the end of her authority. It was the beginning of his undoing. The cuffs still bit into Lorraine Parker's wrists as she sat in the defendant's chair, a place she had spent 23 years observing from the opposite side of the bench. The hum of the courtroom filled her ears, murmurs from clerks, the faint whir of the ceiling fans, the clicking keys of the stenographer preparing her machine. Across the aisle, Officer Derek McAllister stood tall, smoothing the wrinkles from his uniform, like an actor adjusting his costume before the curtain rose. His moment had arrived. This was his theater, his script, and he had performed it so many times that the words rolled off his tongue with the ease of a hymn. "Your Honor," he began, voice steady-pitched with authority. He clasped his hands behind his back, adopting the stance of practiced professionalism. At approximately 8:47 this morning, I observed a suspicious individual attempting to breach courthouse security. Every phrase was calculated, rehearsed. He paused just long enough for the words to sink in, long enough to sound measured, but never hesitant. He gestured toward Lorraine with an open palm, framing her for the gallery, and the substitute judge presiding over the session. The subject was acting erratically. She refused repeated commands to identify herself. When I attempted to conduct a routine search for weapons or contraband, she became aggressive. A murmur rippled across the courtroom, law clerks nodding faintly, a few staffers whispering about these types of incidents. McAllister caught it all, feeding on the affirmation, pressing forward with greater confidence. I was forced, with great reluctance, to use the minimum necessary force to ensure the safety of this courthouse and everyone inside. From the bench, Judge Victor Hollis leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his thin chest. At 62 years old, his hair silver, and his glasses perched low on his nose, Hollis was a man who prided himself on experience. But that very experience made him predictable. He had heard 100 variations of this story before, and they all ended the same way the officer believed the defendant dismissed. His face betrayed little, but the occasional nod was enough for McAllister to sense approval. At the prosecution's table, Angela Ross tapped her pen against a legal pad, eyes bright with sympathy. She had built her career on winning cases through credibility almost always granted to officers in uniform. Every beat of McAllister's script fit perfectly into her expectations. Suspicious intruder, check. Erratic behavior, check. Broken body cam, check. Her pen stopped tapping, replaced by a small, satisfied smile. She was already preparing her closing argument, confident this would be another easy victory. Lorraine Parker watched silently, her face an unreadable mask. Inside her mind catalogued every lie, every twist of language. She noted how McAllister avoided specifics, how he cloaked aggression with vague terms like minimum necessary force, how he wrapped prejudice in phrases the courts had grown accustomed to hearing. It was a performance designed not for truth, but for comfort, a story that allowed everyone in the room to nod along to believe order had been maintained. McAllister continued, his voice now infused with righteous indignation. The subject was carrying suspicious documents, case files, memoranda, and correspondence that clearly did not belong to her. When confronted, she made threats, used profanity, and insisted she was someone important. "I've seen this pattern before, Your Honor. These individuals always claim to be lawyers, judges, senators, anything to escape accountability." Angela Ross leaned forward. "And what about your body camera footage, Officer McAllister?" His expression shifted just enough to feign frustration. "Unfortunately, my body cam malfunctioned this morning. Technical issues, but I do have partial footage from my phone that captures the subject's erratic behavior." He reached into his pocket, producing the device like a magician revealing his trick. The video, carefully clipped to start mid-confrontation, showed Lorraine pulling against his grip, her papers scattered at her feet. Without context, it looked exactly how he described a woman resisting authority, struggling against lawful restraint. Convenient, Lorraine murmured her first words since entering the courtroom. The single word sliced through the silence like a blade, drawing glances from the gallery. She lowered her eyes again, calm, composed, letting the remark hang without elaboration. Judge Hollis adjusted his glasses, peering at McAllister. "And in your 15 years of service, officer, have you encountered situations like this before?" McAllister's chest puffed. "Many times, Your Honor. There is a clear pattern here. Certain individuals believe the rules don't apply to them. They cry discrimination as a shield for their criminal behavior. It's insulting to real victims of discrimination, and to officers like me who risk our lives daily." From the back rows, a smattering of courthouse employees nodded their agreement, silent but visible. They had heard this story before, seen it on the news, read it in reports. The familiarity was soothing, reassuring them that the world worked as they expected officers, brave defendants, dishonest. Angela Ross seized the moment. "The state will show that this defendant attempted to circumvent security, resisted arrest, and assaulted a law enforcement officer performing his duties. We recommend charges of trespassing, resisting arrest, and obstruction." McAllister allowed himself the smallest smile. The net was tightening exactly as planned. He could already taste victory already. Imagine the defendant processed and forgotten another mark in his column of control. But he didn't notice the faint smile at the corner of Lorraine Parker's lips, nor the fire smoldering in her eyes. She sat perfectly still, the portrait of serenity. though her mind was ablaze with precision. Every word he spoke was a thread in the web he thought he was weaving, but Lorraine knew each thread was also evidence of perjury bias and systemic failure. She wasn't just listening. She was preparing. As the stenographer's keys clattered, preserving every syllable for the record, McAllister raised his chin high. "Your Honor," he concluded, "what we have here is not a case of injustice. It is a case of law and order, and the defendant learned this morning that actions have consequences." The words hung in the air like a verdict, his voice confident, his shoulders squared. But across the aisle, Lorraine Parker's silence spoke louder than any outburst could. She kept her gaze steady on Judge Hollis, her expression calm, almost serene. She was waiting for the moment when the lies would collapse under the weight of truth. For the officers lining the walls for the prosecutor, sharpening her arguments for Judge Hollis, nodding with grave approval, this was just another day in court. For Derek McAllister, it was another flawless performance, another suspect buried beneath his script. But for Lorraine Parker, it was something much larger. It was the beginning of a revelation, a gathering storm that would not only consume McAllister's career, but expose the very rot he embodied. Because in a courtroom, truth has a way of surfacing. And McAllister, in his arrogance, had just handed Judge Lorraine Parker everything she needed to ensure that when justice spoke, it would speak louder than his lies. The air inside courtroom 2 was thick with certainty. After Officer Derek McAllister's testimony, his script had landed with its usual wait nods from Judge Victor Hollis, sympathetic murmurs from Prosecutor Angela Ross, and silent agreement from courthouse staff, who had seen this pattern replayed too many times. McAllister's confidence radiated from his posture. He had performed the part flawlessly. To everyone in the room, it seemed the case was already closed. Everyone except the woman in the defendant's chair. Lorraine Parker sat with her wrists cuffed, her cheek bruised, her papers scattered outside on the courthouse steps. But where McAllister expected slumped shoulders or frantic protest, she remained upright, her expression calm, her breathing steady. And then, for the first time since she had entered in chains, she spoke not in anger, not in desperation, but in the clipped, deliberate cadence of someone who had lived her life inside these walls. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear enough to silence the quiet buzz of the gallery. "Before we proceed further, I'd like to correct several factual inaccuracies in Officer McAllister's testimony." The words hung in the air. Defendants weren't supposed to sound like this. They were supposed to plead stammer rage or collapse. They weren't supposed to speak with the calm authority of someone citing law, and certainly not with the precision Lorraine wielded now. Judge Hollis blinked, caught off guard. Angela Ross frowned, her pen halting mid-note. Even McAllister shifted, slightly unsettled by the tone. First, Lorraine continued. "Officer McAllister testified that I was trespassing on government property when he stopped me outside. That statement is inaccurate. At the time of the incident, approximately 8:47 this morning, I was walking on a public sidewalk adjacent to the courthouse entrance. As this court is well aware, the Supreme Court held in United States v. Grace, 1983, that public sidewalks surrounding government buildings are traditional public forums. Citizens cannot be excluded from them, absent a compelling governmental interest. Simply put, I had every legal right to be where I was." The stenographer's fingers paused for a beat before flying again. Angela Ross shifted uncomfortably, not used to hearing Supreme Court precedent from someone seated in the defendant's chair. Hollis adjusted his glasses, murmuring something that sounded like recognition of the case. Lorraine pressed on her tone, measured her cadence, steady as a metronome. "Second Officer McAllister alleged that the documents in my possession appeared stolen, suggesting possible identity theft or fraud. Again, inaccurate. Those documents are authentic legal materials, including pending case files and judicial memoranda, which I had legitimate access to in my professional capacity. Professional capacity. Hollis interrupted, his voice laced with curiosity. Lorraine's lips curved in the faintest of smiles. "We'll arrive at that in due time, Your Honor. For now, let us remain with the matter at hand." McAllister's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected this, not from her, not from anyone. But Lorraine wasn't done. Third, the officer claimed I became verbally aggressive, used profanity, and threatened courthouse security. For the record, I invoke my Fifth Amendment right not to testify regarding any statements allegedly made. However, I will note that any words I spoke were in direct response to being physically assaulted without provocation, warning, or legal justification. Gasps fluttered through the gallery. Assault. The word landed like a stone tossed into still water. McAllister stiffened his face, flushing, but Lorraine kept her gaze steady on Judge Hollis. And finally, she said, her voice now edged with steel, "We come to the matter of the so-called malfunctioning body camera. Your Honor, this courthouse is equipped with an extensive security system. High-definition cameras positioned at 15-foot intervals record all approaches to the main entrance. In addition, as I'm sure the prosecution is aware, county policy requires automatic cloud backups of all officer body cam footage every 60 seconds. Malfunction or not, duplicate files exist." Angela Ross stood abruptly. Objection. The defendant cannot simply demand evidence outside the scope of discovery. Lorraine turned her head slowly, fixing Ross with a gaze that carried the weight of 23 years on the bench. Your Honor, pro se defendants have the constitutional right to present evidence in their own defense. Ferretta, Vitus, California, 1975. Furthermore, under Brady v. Maryland, 1963, the prosecution is obligated to preserve and disclose any exculpatory evidence. I am not requesting discovery. I am reminding this court of its legal duty. The silence was deafening. A law clerk in the back row sat up straighter, recognition dawning. Prosecutor Ross paled, caught between indignation and unease. McAllister's confidence faltered, for the first time his hand twitching against his thigh. Judge Hollis leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Miss Parker, is it? You seem unusually familiar with legal procedure." Lorraine inclined her head, her smile calm but unreadable. "I have some experience with the judicial system, Your Honor." The words carried double weight, though no one in the room yet understood the depth of her understatement. McAllister broke in, desperate to regain control. "She's lying. She's manipulating. That's what they all do. Quote laws they don't understand to confuse the court. I've seen this playbook before." But the crack in his voice betrayed him. Lorraine seized the opening. "Playbook." She repeated, her voice calm but cutting. "No, officer. What you heard were citations of settled law precedents that have governed this nation for decades. Perhaps you are unfamiliar with them, but ignorance of the law is not a defense." The gallery stirred. For the first time, the balance of the room shifted. Lorraine's words didn't come like pleas. They came like rulings. Each sentence was an incision, slicing through McAllister's carefully constructed narrative. She straightened slightly, the cuffs glinting under the fluorescent lights. "Your Honor, I formally request a preservation order for all electronic surveillance data recorded this morning between 8:45 and 9:15. That includes courthouse security footage, officer body cam backups, and any mobile recordings by officers present at the scene. I also request that the evidence be secured in multiple locations to prevent tampering." Angela Ross opened her mouth to object again, but faltered. She knew the law as well as anyone. Lorraine had left no gap, No error. No opening to strike. Judge Hollis hesitated, his pen tapping against the bench. He had presided over countless hearings, but never one quite like this. Defendants didn't dismantle officers with case law. Defendants didn't speak like seasoned attorneys, and they certainly didn't cite Supreme Court rulings with flawless recall. Lorraine folded her hands in her lap, the picture of composure. Your Honor, I may be wearing handcuffs, but let us not forget, this is still a court of law. And in this court, facts matter. Evidence matters. The Constitution matters. No amount of scripted testimony can erase that. The words fell with the weight of truth, undeniable and unshakable. In that moment, every person in the courtroom, from the stenographer to the clerk in the back row, felt the ground begin to shift. McAllister's script was unraveling, thread by thread, under the relentless precision of a woman who knew the law better than anyone in that room. And though no one yet realized it, the defendant who spoke with such calm authority was not just another voice fighting for survival. She was Judge Lorraine Parker, and she was about to turn the courtroom upside down. The silence that followed Lorraine Parker's last words was electric, hanging heavy in the air, like a thundercloud about to break. For a moment, all eyes darted between her calm figure and the substitute Judge Victor Hollis, who shifted uneasily in his seat. Prosecutor Angela Ross's pen had stilled entirely, resting limp against her legal pad. Even Officer Derek McAllister, who only minutes earlier strutted across the courtroom like a conquering hero, seemed smaller now, his confidence rattled by the defendant's unshakable composure and mastery of the law. But Lorraine wasn't finished. She had built her foundation carefully, brick by brick, citing precedent, exposing contradictions, forcing the court to recognize the holes in McAllister's performance. Now it was time to bring the facade crashing down. She adjusted her position in the chair, the handcuffs clinking softly as she moved. Your Honor, she said evenly, there has been considerable discussion this morning about my alleged lack of identification, my supposed trespassing, and the suspicious nature of the documents in my possession. I would like to clarify these points directly. Judge Hollis tilted forward, curiosity sharpening the lines on his face. Proceed, he said cautiously. Lorraine nodded once, then slowly leaned forward as far as the cuffs would allow. From the inner pocket of her blazer, she withdrew a slim leather wallet, dark burgundy, its corners worn with years of use. She placed it on the evidence table with deliberate care. The gold-embossed seal pressed into its surface caught the overhead lights, the scales of justice encircled by the words, United States District Court. This, Lorraine said, her voice firm but calm, is my official judicial credential wallet, issued by this courthouse's administrative office 23 years ago when I took my oath. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Angela Ross leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as if willing the words to be untrue. McAllister stiffened his throat, bobbing as he swallowed hard. Lorraine continued without pause. From her other pocket she pulled a rectangular card laminated in clear plastic, the kind every employee of the courthouse carried. She set it beside the credential wallet. This is my building access card, programmed with my chamber's entry code. It authorizes me to move freely throughout this courthouse without restriction. The magnetic strip has been updated annually, the last renewal completed just 3 months ago. The tension in the room thickened each piece of evidence like another crack spreading across the veneer of McAllister's story. Finally, she reached into her case files, the same ones McAllister had scattered across the courthouse steps, and selected a single document. She unfolded it carefully, then held it up so the courtroom could see the bold header at the top, Judge Lorraine Parker. Daily Court Calendar. The docket listed hearings scheduled for that morning: criminal arraignments at 9 o'clock, a sentencing hearing at 10:30, a civil dispute at 1. This, she said, letting the words drop like stones into still water, is my docket for today. It shows that I was scheduled to preside over multiple cases in this building beginning at 9 a.m., the same hour I was assaulted, handcuffed, and paraded into this room as a so-called intruder. The impact was immediate. Gasps erupted from the gallery. The stenographer paused, hands frozen above her machine, before resuming with renewed urgency, desperate to capture every word. Even Judge Hollis faltered, his pen slipping from his fingers to clatter against the bench. It was Bailiff Henry Cole, a broad-shouldered man with more than a decade of service in the building, who reacted first. His face drained of color as recognition dawned. He had walked past Lorraine Parker in the hallways nearly every day for years, nodded to her in greetings, even carried her robes into chambers before trials. In the heat of the morning's chaos, cuffed and bruised, she had been unrecognizable. But now, with the seal, the card, the docket, there was no mistaking her. "My God," Cole whispered, his voice carrying in the stunned silence. "Judge Parker." The words cracked the courtroom wide open. Angela Ross shot upright. "That's impossible," she blurted, but her voice lacked conviction. Her eyes darted between the evidence on the table and Lorraine's calm face, searching desperately for some thread of denial to cling to. Lorraine turned toward her with quiet authority. "Impossible, counselor. You've argued cases in my courtroom, you've stood at that table before, and I've ruled on your motions. You know me. You just didn't recognize me without my robes." Ross's lips parted, but no sound came. McAllister, however, couldn't contain himself. "She's lying," he barked, though his voice cracked with panic. "She planted those. Those aren't real. This is a setup." Bailiff Cole straightened to his full height, his voice booming. "Enough, Officer McAllister." He stepped forward, placing himself between Lorraine and her attacker. His expression was grim, his hands flexing at his sides, as though ashamed of how easily he had let this go on. "I know Judge Parker. I've worked under her for years, and she's exactly who she says she is." A tidal wave of whispers surged through the gallery. Clerks exchanged wide-eyed looks. Attorneys leaned into each other in disbelief. Reporters in the back scrambled for their phones, fingers flying across screens to break the story. Lorraine sat motionless through it all, her dignity intact, her eyes calm and steady. "Thank you, Mr. Cole," she said softly, before turning her gaze back to Judge Hollis. "Your Honor, I trust we can now dispense with the notion that I was an imposter attempting to breach courthouse security. The record should reflect that I am Judge Lorraine Parker, presiding judge of this very building, assaulted and falsely accused while on my way to fulfill my judicial duties." Judge Hollis's face was ashen. He rubbed his temples as though trying to wake from a nightmare. This is highly irregular," he muttered, though even he seemed to realize the absurdity of the understatement. Irregular, Lorraine thought. No, this was not irregular. This was exposure. The mask had been torn away from a man who had believed himself untouchable, and now the truth stood in plain view. She leaned forward, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. "Officer McAllister has spent the better part of an hour spinning lies under oath. He has painted me as a criminal, a fraud, an intruder. But the evidence on this table, the credentials, the badge, the docket, tell a very different story. And soon, the courthouse surveillance footage will tell the rest." McAllister's face had gone pale, beads of sweat glistening at his temples. His bravado was crumbling, each word from Lorraine striking him harder than any slap he had delivered. "Actions have consequences, officer," she said, echoing the very words he had used against her minutes earlier. "And yours are about to arrive." For the first time since the morning began, the courtroom no longer looked at McAllister as the enforcer of order. They looked at him as what he was, a man who had just assaulted the very embodiment of justice. The unmasking was complete, and while Lorraine Parker sat still cuffed in the defendant's chair, the power in the room had shifted entirely. She was no longer the accused. She was the authority, and everyone knew it. The gavel that had slipped from Judge Victor Hollis's trembling fingers still lay on the bench as murmurs swept through courtroom 2 like a restless tide. The truth had detonated. Lorraine Parker was not a trespasser, not an impostor, but the presiding judge of the very courthouse in which she now sat in chains. Bailiff Henry Cole stood rooted in shame and awe. The gallery whispered in disbelief, and Officer Derek McAllister clung desperately to denial. His once confident grin had collapsed into a twisted mask of fear, his voice breaking as he shouted about planted credentials, a setup, a conspiracy. But no one was listening. The balance had shifted. Judge Hollis cleared his throat, his voice quavering. "The court will recess for 15 minutes, he announced. He avoided Lorraine's gaze, gathering his robes in fumbling haste, as though eager to vanish from a scene that was quickly spiraling beyond his control. The bailiffs moved awkwardly, uncertain whether to keep Lorraine cuffed or to free her. It was Henry Cole who stepped forward, his voice thick with contrition. "Your Honor, I—" Lorraine stopped him with a small, steady gesture. "Not now, Mr. Cole. There will be time for apologies later. For now, there is work to be done." When the gavel fell to mark the recess, she rose from the defendant's chair with a dignity that made the chains around her wrists seem almost symbolic symbols of how quickly justice could be shackled by lies, and how swiftly it could break free when truth emerged. In the holding chamber adjacent to the courtroom, Lorraine was finally granted privacy. The cuffs clicked open, leaving red welts on her wrists. She flexed her fingers slowly, letting blood flow back into her hands, then reached immediately for the phone mounted on the wall. Her voice was calm, but beneath the surface ran a current of command honed over decades. "Chief Judge Sloan," she said when the line connected. "Lorraine." The voice on the other end was sharp with concern. "We heard there was some kind of incident. Are you all right?" "I've been better," Lorraine admitted, glancing at the faint purple bruise blooming across her cheek in the reflection of the chamber's glass. "But listen carefully. I need you to secure every second of courthouse surveillance footage from this morning, between 8:45 and 9:15. Multiple backups, stored in separate locations. And I want every case Officer Derek McAllister has testified in over the past 5 years, pulled and reviewed. Every single one." There was a pause. Then Miriam Sloane's voice returned steady and resolute. "Consider it done. But Lorraine, you can't preside over this yourself." "I know," Lorraine interrupted softly. "But before I step aside, this building, this staff and that officer need to see who I am. They need to remember that justice wears a face. And today, it is mine." She hung up the phone, her pulse steady as a drumbeat. Moments later, Henry Cole entered the chamber, his eyes downcast, his large frame awkward with guilt. In his hands, he carried a long garment bag and a small wooden box. "Your robes, Your Honor, and your gavel," he said quietly. Lorraine unzipped the garment bag. The black fabric spilled into her hands, heavy yet familiar like armor reforged. She slid her arms through the sleeves, smoothing the folds over her shoulders. For 23 years, she had worn these robes into battle against corruption, prejudice, and injustice. Today they felt heavier but also stronger. They carried the morning's bruise, the laughter of complicit officers, the shock of a system caught in its own hypocrisy. And they carried her resolve to make this day a turning point. From the wooden box, she lifted her ceremonial gavel. Its polished handle gleamed, engraved with the words she had sworn by at her swearing. Injustice is blind, but she sees all. She gripped it tightly, feeling the balance of weight, the familiarity of power. It was more than wood. It was a promise. When the 15 minutes expired, the bailiffs returned to escort her back. But this time, she did not walk in as a defendant. She entered through the judge's chamber door, the same path she had walked thousands of times before. "All rise," Henry Cole's voice boomed, carrying an authority that trembled with both shame and reverence. "Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Lorraine Parker presiding." The words struck like thunder. The gallery leapt to its feet, shock etched into every face. Lawyers clutched their briefcases, clerks froze mid-motion, and even Judge Hollis, who had slunk to the side in shame, bowed his head as Lorraine ascended the steps to her bench. The black robes flowed around her like a tide reclaiming the shore. The bruise on her cheek stood out stark against the fabric, not as a mark of weakness, but as a badge of truth. She carried the gavel in her right hand, lifted it once, and brought it down with a sound that reverberated through every corner of the room. "Be seated," she said, her voice calm but filled with steel. The room obeyed. Lorraine's eyes swept across the courtroom, pausing on McAllister. The officer who had slapped her, cuffed her, and paraded her in front of his peers now sat hunched, his complexion drained, his swagger gone. He clutched the table as though it might anchor him in a storm he no longer controlled. For the first time, he seemed to realize that he hadn't subdued a powerless woman on the courthouse steps. He had assaulted the very authority he had sworn to serve. "Officer McAllister Lorraine," said her voice measured this morning, "you testified under oath before this court. Do you recall the substance of that testimony?" McAllister's mouth opened, then closed again. He gave the smallest of nods. "Good," Lorraine continued, "because in a moment we will compare your words to the evidence Chief Judge Sloan is now preserving. Evidence you conveniently forgot existed when you claimed your body camera malfunctioned. Evidence that will show precisely what occurred outside these walls at 8:47 a.m. The stenographer's keys clicked furiously. Reporters leaned forward, pens scratching across paper. The gallery was silent, every breath caught in collective anticipation. Lorraine set the gavel down gently, folding her hands atop the bench. This court has always demanded truth. And as of this morning, the truth is no longer in dispute. It is preserved in high-definition cameras, in automatic cloud backups, and in the eyes of every witness who stood laughing while justice itself was dragged in chains. I will no longer sit silent while this system shields lies with uniforms and cloaks, prejudice in procedure. Her words rang out heavy with finality. For 15 years, McAllister had hidden behind a badge and a script. Now, with her robes restored and her authority undisputed, Lorraine Parker had reclaimed the stage. The defendant's chair no longer belonged to her. It belonged to him. The robes, the gavel, the oath, all of it had come back to her shoulders. And with it came the weight of history. Because on that morning in that courtroom, justice itself had changed seats. The courtroom seemed to shrink as Judge Lorraine Parker settled fully into her bench, her black robes flowing around her like the wings of justice itself. The ceremonial gavel rested in her hand, its engraved words gleaming under the overhead lights. Justice is blind, but she sees all. Every eye was fixed on her. Every breath in the room felt suspended. The transformation was complete. No longer the defendant in handcuffs, she was once again the presiding authority of the courthouse. But today, she was not merely presiding over a docket of scheduled cases, she was presiding over the unraveling of a lie 15 years in the making. "Officer McAllister," she began, her voice steady as stone, "you testified under oath this morning that I attempted to breach courthouse security, that I was erratic, aggressive, resistant. That your body camera conveniently malfunctioned, leaving only fragments of partial video. She paused, letting the weight of each phrase press down. It is time we see the truth. From the prosecution's table, Angela Ross shifted uneasily, her confidence unraveling. She had built her case on McAllister's testimony, never doubting his script. But as Lorraine reached for a small tablet handed to her by bailiff Henry Cole, Ross's eyes widened with dread. "Exhibit 1, Lorraine announced. She tapped the screen, and the large courtroom monitor flickered to life. The feed opened with a wide shot from Courthouse Camera 7, positioned 15 feet above the main steps. The image was crystal clear, the morning sunlight, the bronze plaque above the doors, and Lorraine herself walking calmly toward the entrance in her blazer and slacks, briefcase in hand. Gasps rippled through the gallery. "There I am," Lorraine said, her tone neutral. "No signs of aggression, no trespassing, no breach." The footage continued, now showing McAllister stepping into her path. His hand shot out, striking her across the face with brutal force. The slap cracked through the courtroom speakers so loudly that several spectators flinched. The video captured the briefcase flying from her grip, documents scattering like startled birds, and McAllister's hand clamping around her throat. In the gallery, one clerk covered her mouth with both hands. An attorney shook his head in disbelief. Lorraine's voice remained calm. Exhibit 2. The screen split, showing another angle from Courthouse Camera 8. This angle captured McAllister, pinning her against the granite wall, twisting her arms behind her, and snapping the cuffs on. His mouth moved, the words crystal clear through the camera's audio pickup. "Filthy animals like you don't belong in courthouses." The gallery erupted. Gasps, murmurs, one shouted, "My God!" Judge Hollis, still seated stiffly to the side, lowered his head into his hands. Lorraine tapped again. Exhibit 3 body camera backup automatically uploaded to the county's cloud every 60 seconds. The monitor displayed a timestamp Yo8:47:12. McAllister's perspective filled the screen. His own voice snarled through the speakers. "Look at this uppity thing thinking she can just walk into my courthouse. Time to teach another lesson." The room went deathly still. Lorraine's eyes flicked toward McAllister, who had gone pale, sweat beading at his temples. His hands twitched on the table as if he were trying to hold on to the last threads of denial. The footage continued, the slap, the shove, the cuffs, all from his own camera. Not edited, not malfunctioning. Unmistakable. "Exhibit." For Lorraine, said, her tone edged with steel. "Audio from Officer Greg Stanton's body cam." The speakers crackled. Stanton's voice rang out, mocking and gleeful. "Man, McAllister's really going off today. Think she's actually somebody important like she keeps saying." Another voice answered Officer Lila Morris, her tone dripping with disdain. "Nah, look at her. Probably just another welfare queen trying to scam the system." "Martinez," she stopped herself, correcting quickly. "McAllister knows what he's doing. Just another liar getting what she deserves." The gallery erupted again, this time not with gasps, but with disgust. Reporters scribbled furiously. One attorney muttered "unbelievable" loud enough for others to hear. Lorraine let the audio run until Stanton and Morris broke into laughter, their voices overlapping with McAllister's grunts as he forced her into the cuffs. She tapped the screen once more, silencing the playback. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice low, but carrying the force of a gavel strike. "This is not the story Officer McAllister spun before this court. This is the truth. High-definition cameras, cloud backups, and the unguarded words of complicit officers. What we see here is not professionalism. It is brutality. What we hear is not duty. It is mockery." She lifted the gavel slightly, holding it in front of her. "This is not an isolated act. This is a pattern." Her words struck like hammer blows. Each exhibit had stripped another layer from McAllister's defense. The officer sat hunched, his once crisp uniform now wrinkled with sweat. His jaw worked furiously, but no words came. Lorraine turned her gaze to Stanton and Morris, seated uneasily in the gallery. "Officers Stanton and Morris, you both testified or were prepared to testify that Officer McAllister acted with professionalism. Would you like to revise your statements in light of the evidence we've just reviewed?" Neither spoke. Stanton stared at the floor. Morris shifted in her seat, her face pale. "Silence is not a shield," Lorraine said softly. "Every second of laughter, every word of disdain, every ounce of complicity is now preserved in this record. And this court will remember it." The gavel came down with a sharp crack. The sound reverberated through the chamber, final and undeniable. Lorraine Parker's eyes swept the room one last time. For 15 years, Officer McAllister has relied on lies, rehearsed scripts, and broken cameras to shield his misconduct. Today, the cameras did not break. Today, his script failed. And today, the truth has spoken louder than his lies. The gallery erupted not with applause, but with a collective exhale, the sound of people realizing they had just witnessed the collapse of a false world order. Reporters rushed from the room, their phones already buzzing with news alerts. Clerks exchanged glances, heavy with shame and relief. And Officer Derek McAllister. He sagged in his chair, the color drained from his face, his once bright eyes now dull with the realization that the empire of lies he had built over a decade and a half had crumbled in less than 15 minutes of video. The storm had arrived not with thunder, but with evidence, and there was no shelter left for him. The last echoes of the body cam audio still clung to the air like smoke after a fire. The courtroom had just witnessed what many thought impossible, an officer's lies obliterated in real time, every detail exposed by his own words and the laughter of his colleagues. Yet Judge Lorraine Parker knew the morning's revelation could not end with one man's downfall. The evidence storm had torn down Derek McAllister's script, but storms pass. If she did not anchor this reckoning in something larger, the system would rebuild itself brick by rotten brick. And so she pivoted. "Officer McAllister." She began, her voice steady, every syllable cutting like a scalpel. "Your actions this morning were not an anomaly. They are part of a pattern that this court can no longer ignore." She lifted a thick manila folder from the bench. The folder bulged with documents, its edges worn from weeks of review. She laid it flat, then opened it wide, revealing a stack of complaints, transcripts, and reports clipped together. "This file contains the history of your career. 15 years in uniform. 46 formal complaints." She paused to let the number register. 46. That averages to more than 3 complaints every single year. Gasps rippled across the gallery. Lorraine continued, her voice sharpening. "Complaint number 1 filed in 2009 by Mrs. Rosa Delgado, a 63-year-old grandmother who alleged you called her a racial slur during a traffic stop and slammed her face into the hood of her car when she requested your badge number. The department ruled it." She flipped the page, unsubstantiated. She let the word hang in the air, heavy with irony. "Complaint number 12, 2012. Jamal Washington, a 17-year-old honor student, alleged that you planted narcotics in his backpack after he refused to provide information about his older brother." Once again, unsubstantiated. McAllister's jaw tightened. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table. "Complaint number 23, 2016. Dr. Michael Johnson, a respected cardiologist, alleged that you arrested him outside his own home because you refused to believe a black man could live in that neighborhood. He spent 6 hours in jail before his attorney secured his release." The department's finding, she flipped another page. unsubstantiated. The gallery erupted into low murmurs, disbelief mixing with fury. Reporters scribbled furiously, pens scratching like thunder. Lorraine raised her hand and the room stilled. But here is where the pattern becomes undeniable. She reached beneath the bench and pulled out a large chart mounted on a foam board. Bailiff Henry Cole carried it to an easel beside the prosecution's table, angling it so everyone could see. Across the chart were bold red and blue bars, numbers neatly labeled. Over 15 years, Officer McAllister made 1,342 arrests. Of those 1,073, approximately 80% involved people of color. And yet, the demographics of his patrol district are 42% white, 31% Hispanic, and 27% black. The disparity speaks for itself. Angela Ross shifted in her seat, her face pale. She had relied on McAllister's credibility for years, never questioning the numbers that now shouted corruption. Lorraine gestured toward another section of the chart. Use of force reports. In 63% of arrests involving people of color, Officer McAllister documented the use of physical force, takedowns, strikes, chokeholds. In contrast, his use of force against white suspects, 12%. The disparity was damning, the silence suffocating. Lorraine continued, her voice unwavering. Of the 1,073 arrests of people of color, 432 cases were dismissed due to lack of evidence, prosecutorial misconduct, or constitutional violations. That is nearly 40%. And yet not once did this department initiate disciplinary action against him. The courtroom was buzzing now, outrage simmering. Lorraine let it build before striking with the final blow. She opened another folder and withdrew a document stamped with the county seal. Over the past 15 years, this county has paid out $2.3 million in settlements and judgments directly related to Officer McAllister's conduct. $2.3 million of taxpayer money that could have funded schools, hospitals, or community programs spent instead to clean up after one man's abuse of power. She held the document high. This is not the footprint of a single rogue officer. This is the footprint of a system that protects misconduct, that buries complaints, that calls 46 allegations unsubstantiated, while quietly paying millions to make them disappear. This is complicity. The words thundered through the room. The stenographer's keys clattered furiously to keep up. Lorraine's eyes swept across the gallery, landing on the officers seated in the back, Stanton and Morris pale and silent after their laughter had been played aloud. This system did not fail because one officer lied. It failed because too many nodded along. It failed because prosecutors like Ms. Ross, she glanced at the table, accepted testimony without scrutiny. It failed because judges like Mr. Hollis, she turned briefly preferred comfort to courage. It failed because every time a complaint was filed, the department's default was to erase it rather than confront it. Judge Hollis flinched visibly, his hands twisting nervously in his lap. Angela Ross lowered her eyes to her papers, her face burning with shame. Lorraine's voice softened, but carried more force than ever. Justice is not blind when it looks away. Justice is not impartial when it buries 46 complaints and calls them all unsubstantiated. Justice is not justice when it laughs at brutality. She reached again for her gavel, lifting it high enough for the light to catch the engraved words. Today, this court must decide whether it will remain complicit or whether it will finally recognize the pattern of power abused. McAllister sat, slumped, his face ashen, his eyes darting frantically between the chart, the documents, and the woman he had once slapped without hesitation. His empire of lies had already crumbled under the weight of video evidence. Now the rubble was being sifted to reveal not just his crimes, but the architecture of an entire system built to shield them. The gallery was silent, every person holding their breath. For many, it was the first time they had seen numbers laid bare, statistics aligned with lived experiences long dismissed. It was no longer anecdote, no longer allegation. It was fact. And it was damning. Lorraine Parker lowered the gavel, slowly, her eyes never leaving McAllister. "You said this morning that people like me need to learn our place. My place. Officer McAllister is here on this bench, holding accountable not only you, but the system that enabled you. And your place as of today is in the record books as evidence of what happens when lies go unchallenged." The gavel came down with a crack like thunder. The sound reverberated off the marble walls, echoing through every corner of the courthouse. And in that moment, it was no longer just Derek McAllister on trial. It was the entire system that had carried him for 15 years. The thunder of Judge Lorraine Parker's gavel still reverberated in the marble chamber when the full weight of truth settled upon the courtroom like a tidal wave. Officer Derek McAllister, who had once strutted through these halls with unchecked arrogance, now sat crumpled in the defendant's chair, his face ashen, his hands trembling as if the very air had turned to iron chains around his wrists. The evidence storm had left no shelter. The statistics had laid bare his history of abuse. And now the final reckoning could no longer be delayed. Officer McAllister, Lorraine, said, her voice resonant with both solemnity and fire, "This court has reviewed the evidence. High-definition footage from courthouse security cameras, unedited body cam backups, audio from your fellow officers, and the staggering record of 46 complaints. Together, these pieces form not merely a picture, but a complete portrait of misconduct. You stand before this court accused not only of failing your oath, but of betraying the very Constitution you swore to uphold." The gallery sat frozen, every eye riveted to the bench. Lorraine leaned forward slightly, her tone cutting through the silence. "On the charge of assault in the first degree," she said, "this court finds you guilty." The words hit like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples visible in McAllister's hunched frame. "On the charge of perjury lying under oath in this very courtroom, this court finds you guilty." Reporters scribbled furiously, the scratching of their pens sounding like rainfall in the otherwise silent chamber. "And on the charge of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, a federal offense punishable by up to 10 years in prison, this court finds you guilty." The final word cracked like a whip. McAllister flinched as though struck. Lorraine did not pause. She had presided over sentencing for more than 2 decades, but never had she spoken words with such weight, with such historical consequence. "For these crimes, for the damage inflicted not only upon your victims, but upon the very integrity of this justice system, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." Gasps erupted from the gallery, followed by a stunned silence that felt almost sacred. The sentence was not just punishment, it was a declaration that the era of impunity was ending. McAllister collapsed into his chair, his face buried in his hands. His once iron spine had turned to dust. The officer who had boasted about teaching others their place was now learning his own. But Lorraine was not finished. She turned her gaze to the packed courtroom, her eyes sweeping across lawyers, clerks, officers, and citizens alike. This judgment is not only for Officer McAllister. This is a judgment on a culture of silence that has infected this department for too long. It is a judgment on every unsubstantiated complaint, every conveniently malfunctioning body cam, every laugh that echoed while brutality was disguised as professionalism. Her words reverberated with the weight of centuries, as though carried by the ghosts of all those whose voices had been silenced in courtrooms like this one. Effective immediately, she continued, "This court is ordering a federal review of every case touched by Officer McAllister. 432 dismissals, over 1,000 arrests. Each will be reopened, each will be reviewed, and every wrongfully convicted individual will have their day in court. The gallery erupted in whispers, disbelief mingling with relief. Families who had sat through years of trials and dismissals felt hope flicker for the first time. Attorneys who had fought uphill battles against falsified testimony exchanged glances of vindication. Lorraine's tone grew sharper. This department will also come under federal oversight. Officers Greg Stanton and Lila Morris, whose voices were heard mocking this assault, will face charges of perjury and conspiracy. Prosecutors who enabled this culture of complicity will be reviewed, and the leadership of this department will answer for 15 years of negligence. Angela Ross lowered her head, her pen lying idle. She had built her career on cases like McAllister's. Now her silence was evidence enough of her complicity. Reporters had already left the room in waves, their phones buzzing, as headlines broke across the nation. Officer sentenced to 25 years for assaulting federal judge. Federal oversight descends on County Police Department. Judge Lorraine Parker shatters systemic silence. Lorraine raised her gavel one last time. This morning I was assaulted, humiliated, and dragged into this courtroom in chains. But this is not about me. This is about every citizen who has walked into a courtroom believing the system was stacked against them. This is about restoring faith that justice is not just a word carved in marble, but a living promise. The gavel came down with finality. Court is adjourned. The room erupted not with chaos, but with applause. It was spontaneous, rising like a wave, 5 minutes of sustained clapping that rolled through the marble halls and spilled into the streets outside. For once, applause did not belong to the spectacle of authority abusing power. It belonged to justice taking her place again. In the weeks that followed, the reverberations grew louder. McAllister was processed into federal custody, his badge stripped, his pension revoked. His name, once uttered with fear in neighborhoods across the city, became synonymous with disgrace. He spent his days in protective custody, a fallen officer learning what it meant to live without the shield of a badge. The Federal Review uncovered layers of rot. 12 officers were terminated. 4 supervisors faced criminal charges. 432 cases were reopened. Dozens of wrongfully convicted individuals freed, hundreds more granted retrials or sentence reductions. The county paid an additional $8.7 million in compensation to McAllister's victims, this time taken directly from the police department's budget. But the most enduring legacy was not McAllister's downfall. It was Lorraine Parker's rise as a national emblem of judicial integrity. Within months, she was invited to speak at law schools and conferences, her story retold on every major network. She spoke not with triumph, but with measured urgency. Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice delivered is justice for all. The courthouse itself bore her name within a year, rededicated as the Lorraine Parker Federal Courthouse. A bronze plaque at the entrance marked the morning when a judge was dragged in chains only to rise and restore faith in the system that betrayed her. The inscription read simply, "Here justice reclaimed her voice." Most powerful of all was the change in the community. Citizens who had once feared filing complaints began coming forward. Oversight boards were established. Training programs on constitutional rights and unconscious bias became mandatory. The laughter that had once filled locker rooms and hallways was replaced with caution, accountability, and, in some corners, genuine reform. And in quiet moments, Lorraine Parker reflected on the irony McAllister had sought to remind her of her place. Yet, it was his downfall that reminded the nation of hers on the bench behind the gavel, safeguarding justice not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they did not belong. Her story reshaped the conversation about power, prejudice, and accountability. It proved that even in the most corrupted corners of the system, justice could rise, wear her robes, and strike back with the force of truth. The reverberations continued long after the applause faded. What can we as American citizens take from the story of Judge Lorraine Parker and Officer Derek McAllister? It is more than the fall of one corrupt officer or the rise of one courageous judge. It is a reminder that justice is not automatic. It must be demanded, defended, and delivered every single day. For 15 years, 46 complaints were buried. For 15 years, more than 80% of McAllister's arrests targeted people of color. For 15 years, silence allowed corruption to spread like rust through the gears of the system. And yet, in less than 25 minutes of video truth stripped away every lie. That is the power of evidence of accountability and of one voice refusing to bow. Lorraine Parker's story teaches us that no badge, no robe, no title places anyone above the law. Her bruised cheek became a national mirror, forcing Americans to confront the uncomfortable truth. Prejudice in uniform is not just misconduct, it is a betrayal of the Constitution itself. But it also showed us something else, that courage can reset the balance. That one gavel strike can echo through courthouses, communities, and the nation at large. McAllister's 25-year sentence was not just punishment for him, it was a signal to every citizen that silence is dangerous and complicity is deadly. Federal oversight overturned convictions, millions in compensation. These weren't gifts, they were the price of ignoring the truth for too long. So what do we do with this lesson? We demand better. We question authority when its story doesn't match the evidence. We protect those who come forward with the truth. And we never forget that justice is not a spectator sport. It requires each of us to stand, speak, and act. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the fight for fairness is far from over, then don't let it stop here. Subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and share this video so that millions more can hear Lorraine Parker's story. Let her voice, her courage, and her gavel strike remind America that justice may be blind, but she sees everything, and eventually she comes for everyone.